Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I'll Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And today, it is time for another edition of Female First, which means we are joined by the wonderful, the magnificent Yves. Welcome, Yves.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
It's so nice to have you. We were very, very lucky, listeners. We got to hang out with Yves IRL, as they say, in Washington, D.C. recently. And it was so great. It was so great seeing you. We did a panel together on Better Banter. Both Samantha and I said that you were a very steady presence when we were so anxious. We really appreciated that.
Yeah.
So it was a good time. It was a good time.
Yeah, and we weren't there that long, but I feel like we got a good amount of like balance of our time working in our time, like actually being able to step outside and breathe fresh air.
Yeah.
So that was nice.
I feel like we were bonding. Maybe I was bonding a little too much.
No. I mean, what would life be if you don't actually try to connect with the people you're interacting with?
It's true, but some people don't. So, I'm like, but it was amazing before I get too negative about myself. But anyway, it was amazing. It was such a good time. I feel like we got to meet new people. It was nice having you around because you were the extrovert of our group. I feel like, yeah, you were. You were the one that would like walk into a place
Samantha.
And immediately start talking to a stranger. And Anney and I would just look at each other like, do we stand here? Do we join the conversation? What do we do?
I'm in denial right now because I would not describe myself as an extrovert.
For the event, you really were. You went out there and I was like, she's talking to everybody. I'm just going to sit back and watch.
Maybe on some spectrum, somebody's spectrum.
That's fair. On our spectrum.
Yeah.
You're very much the extrovert in the three of us group.
Maybe it's like the networking spectrum. You were very extroverted, and we were like, Samantha and I were like, don't look our way.
Looking down, trying to find our footsteps and not fall, and be like, don't look up. They're staring at you. At one point, Anney did say, don't make eye contact, move. To me.
I did, but
I think I know why that was.
Yeah. It was for a good reason. It was for a good reason, but I feel like that's one of those comments. I was like, that's us.
Yeah, for listeners, y'all know how it is when you're around a bunch of people who are new and old, who, can get kind of awkward in situations when you haven't seen somebody in a really long time. And you got to stay professional.
You do. So Samantha and I did a kind of brief recap of our thoughts about the trip. But Yves, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share about our time in DC?
I think it was just nice to do a panel together overall because we've never done a panel together before. And y'all have been doing the show for a really long time. And I've been coming on doing Female First for a really long time. So I think it just made sense for us to talk about banter because that's what we've been doing for so long. But was also nice to get out of these little rectangular windows and into real life and talk to people and talk to each other. So I think that was a breath of fresh air. That's just a general comment for me. You would think that we would have done something like this together before, but we haven't.
Yeah. And I feel like we did get a lot of good feedback from people saying that we did a good job. We had good banter. Look at
Yes. And I think that the conference has it available via podcast now. I think people might have to pay for that. But if folks are interested in hearing the panel, it's called Better Banter that we did at Podcast Movement. You can listen to that.
Yes. I almost had a heart attack this morning when I opened my email, my work inbox, and I had 50 emails.
I'm assuming that was like a mistake because I sat there, I was like, what is happening? Did I do? And then because I was half asleep when I saw that, I was like, I just imagined that because I quickly deleted all of them. And then I was like, wait, did I dream that?
I love to know that that's how you handle work email. That's great.
Yeah, you don't try to check the veracity if you really need this thing. If it's legitimate, you just toss it in the trash.
I love
it's like getting the really important the really important letter in the mail. When you see those scam letters in the mail, you know the ones that they try to make look official where you have to tear the sides off and might look handwritten in the front. Do you just automatically throw them in the trash?
It's according to whether or not where it's from and who it's from. I'm like, if I don't know why you would be like, if it's a stranger from I'm like, yeah, no, it's crap.
I hope you haven't thrown any checks away.
If someone's sending me a random check, I'm gonna think that's a fraud too. Like the amount of fraud that has happened with mail, especially, that I'm like, they're trying to get me. I'm not gonna do this. I'm not. That's the level I'm at, to be fair. But yeah, no, like when those emails that are all repeat from a generic, I was like, yeah, this is just filling up my inbox. And Anney knows I don't like notifications like that, so I'm like, it's got to go. It's got to go. Immediately.
I often lament no one reads my emails, and this is
I would read
giving me further doubts. Just to clarify, basically, Podcast Movement sent a notification every time they uploaded one of the panels for you to listen to. So it was
is that what that was?
Yeah.
I thought it was a mistake.
Ours is on there. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, but it was like 45 emails, and then I had 5 other things, I think. But it was a lot.
It was a lot. It was a lot, y'all. I'm going to need you to condense that to whomever sent those emails. Thank you for doing your job.
I almost had a panic attack.
Like, what did I miss?
What has gone wrong since I went to bed?
Someone has reported me. I've been banned from podcasts.
Damn it. Well,
it's happened.
On to my next career. I'm really excited to talk about the person you brought today, Yves, because we talk about religion a lot on this show. A lot. And I just thought this was a really fascinating story. So who did you bring for us today?
So I brought Jarena Lee. I am excited to talk about her too, because y'all talk about religion a lot, but I feel like I haven't brought a lot of religious people on for Female First. So I'm excited too. Jarena Lee was the first woman preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she was the first Black American woman to publish an autobiography. And those two things are huge and just kind of disparate. Like, she has this big religious background, and I think the autobiography thing just kind of happened tangentially. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I love that she did write about herself in the ways that she did. So I'm grateful for her doing that. So yeah, should we get into it?
Let's get into it.
Jarena Lee was born on February 11, 1783 in Cape May, New Jersey. So she said her parents were free and Black, and their family was poor. When she was about 7 years old, she was hired out. So parents sometimes did this to make extra money. They would send their children away to work so that they could earn money for the family. This is what happened with Jarena. She was taken about 60 miles away, and she had to do domestic work for the Sharp family. Throughout her childhood and her young adulthood, she was placed with different families, and she lived away from home. She said that her parents were, quote, wholly ignorant of the knowledge of God. So by that, what I would assume she means is that they weren't teaching her about Christianity. There was no Bible around the house. There were no other forms of spirituality that they were invested in themselves and probably teaching her as well. But she still turns to spirituality when she's young. So it seems like kind of early on, we're already seeing these like self-imposed instances of her having like come to religion moments. She has a lot of those throughout her life, but it happens really early on. And I'm thinking about that. I'm a child of Southern Baptist faith, Black Southern Baptist faith. And, you know, that's an inherited thing a lot of the time. And it was for me. So that's not even close to the experience that I had. I was like, what else is out there? Like this, you know, isn't resonating with me that much. So thinking about her not having any sort of spirituality in her life and having these really big, emphatic moments is very interesting to me. But I'll talk about that moment she had early on. So she says that she lies to the woman she's working for. She tells her that she did some work when she really had it. And then this is a quote from her. She says, "The Spirit of God moved in power through my conscience and told me I was a wretched sinner. On this account, so great was the impression and so strong were the feelings of guilt that I promised in my heart that I would not tell another lie." So she's like, I lied, but that felt horrible. Like she seemed a little, I don't know if you would call that type A or what, but she definitely had a lot of strong feelings just because she told a tiny lie. And I can only imagine, like, she was tired. She was young and she was working for a family and she was away from her family. I can't imagine the amount of separation trauma, like labor trauma, economic trauma that was happening in that moment. And she is beating herself up for telling what is seemingly a small lie. I think we can already start to understand her personality and how intense it is from that description. But she said her heart still grew harder after this, and God kept working on her. So in 1804, she goes to hear a Presbyterian missionary preach at one afternoon meeting. And he reads the Psalms, and she has this renewed conviction after having that hardened heart. She's like, I got this renewed conviction. And she says, "Lord, I am vile, conceived in sin, born unholy and unclean, sprung from man, whose guilty fall corrupts the race and taints us all." So she's had this moment in when she realizes her sin. This helps her feel the weight of her sins, but she's still young. She doesn't really know how to deal with that. And she tries to die by suicide. And what she says, she talks about this moment in a little bit more detail. I won't go into the details here, but she says that it was the unseen arm of God that saved her. And she does continue in other moments of her life to struggle with suicidal ideation. But a little while later, she goes to Philly and she goes to an African Methodist Episcopal Church there. And she hears Reverend Richard Allen preach. So he is the reverend who founds the AME church. And in this really dramatic moment, she explains accepting God. And she says, "That instant, it appeared to me as if a garment, which had entirely enveloped my whole person, even to my fingers' ends, split at the crown of my head and was stripped away from me, passing like a shadow from my sight, when the glory of God seemed to cover me in its stead." I was really struck by her writing in that moment. This is something that she wrote in her autobiography. It's so image heavy. It's so image rich. It's so like fanciful. It's so imaginative, but it doesn't seem like she's just doing this as wordplay. She's like, no, this is what I really felt. This is what I really saw in the moment. And there are other moments throughout her autobiography when she really hones in on those details of the visions that she's having and the feelings that she's feeling. She also has visions of hell that she describes and of Satan. And these are moments that really presses her deeper into her religious journey. But she moves along and she's feeling like she's been forgiven for her sins and she's converted to God. And at a certain point, she gets to a place in her journey where she stops feeling fear and guilt and distress. And she starts wanting to know more of the right way of the Lord. So I'll stop here and say that historians and scholars who have done research on her and her story, there's some speculation around what her mental state was at the time. They have said that she might have had mental illness, but that is just derived from all of her descriptions of what she was going through. So the suicidal ideation, ideas around sin, the fact that she was separated from her family so young and had to do domestic labor in other people's homes. People were enslaved around her. So she was not enslaved, but this was during chattel slavery was happening around her. So that's unclear, but it is something that historians have thought about and have speculated around, but it's not anything that I would feel comfortable saying is one way or the other because they haven't said that. But about 4 or 5 years later, she's drawn to preach. And she tells Reverend Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, that the Lord told her to preach. She was called to it. She got signs and she is supposed to preach. She's really feeling it in her spirit. But he's like, no. Okay, women can't do that. Mm-hmm. I know y'all have seen this a lot throughout all of the things that y'all have talked about in history, where it's like, okay, you're coming to ask me this, but you know women can't do that. Mm-hmm. That's what he said to her. He said, yeah, that's not allowed in our practice. Yeah. And he was also like, yeah, I can't remember her name, but he said, yeah, this other woman came to me and asked me that too, but you know, she was wilding too. Like, she can't do that and you can't do that. But she's thinking, Jarena Lee is thinking this. She says, for as unseemly as it may appear nowadays for a woman to preach, it should be remembered that nothing is impossible with God. And why should it be thought impossible, heterodox, or improper for a woman to preach, seeing that the Savior died for the woman as well as for the man? She has a point. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the logic of it, it's like, this is for all of us. We're trying to spread this message. Why are you keeping me from trying to do the work that needs to be done here? If you're trying to evangelize, if you're trying to bring more people into the faith, if you're trying to get more people to sign up to come to AME Church and, you know, be saved, then why you won't let me preach? Like, I'm called to it. If God can call you to it as a man, then why can't God call me to it? So she calls that out. She recognizes how much it doesn't make sense. And that spirit of wanting to preach remains with her. But there is something that disrupts that. And that's when she marries Joseph Lee, which she does in 1811. And he's a pastor in Snow Hill, which is a community that's just outside of Philly. And Jarena doesn't know anybody in Snow Hill besides her husband, so it's hard. She's having a hard time adjusting because customs there are different, and she doesn't have friends to hang out with. It's just like her husband's preaching, he's doing this thing that she couldn't even do just now, and she's kind of having to sideline herself for him. She asked him to go to Philadelphia with her, but he doesn't want to leave his congregation, so she's like, well, guess I got to stay here because that's what I got to do as his wife. So she acquiesces to his ministry, and she has 2 children with him. I think she has several children. She has more than that, but they die. And she has 2 children who survive. And in 1817, he dies as well, her husband. So at this point, there's not much that she writes about her marriage to her husband. And I've also seen historians talk about this, where it's like they don't really know anything in detail about her relationship with her husband, because she doesn't talk about it in her autobiography. And that's one of the main sources. That is like the main source of information about her. But it is the shortest part of the entire autobiography, which I am very curious about. I would love to know more about it, but she goes into such great detail about other parts of her life. And there is such little detail about her marriage to her husband, how she felt about him, what they did on a day-to-day basis, where he was from, how he grew up, how he thought about things. You know, it's none of that in there. Mm-hmm. So I can't really tell y'all much about her marriage to her husband. But after he dies, she clearly, during this time, it's pretty clear if you read in between the lines that this whole time she was still pining to preach. Because right after he dies, she basically, this is 8 years after she first asked Reverend Richard Allen to preach. She's feeling that fire again, and she's willing to speak up about it. And Reverend Allen is now the bishop of the AME Church in America. He becomes that in 1816. And one day, there's another reverend named Richard Williams who's preaching at Bethel Church. And at one point, they describe it as him seeming to have lost the spirit. I don't know what that sermon was. I don't think there's record of that sermon. None of Jarena's sermons are extant either. So that is another thing I would love to see, like what her sermons actually were. She talked about what she talked about in them a little bit, but full sermons are not available. But it is said that this guy's sermon wasn't going so well. He had the people in the first half, but in the second half, he kind of lost them. And Jarena's like, well, I got something to say. I'm feeling the spirit. So she jumps up and she starts preaching on the passage that he was preaching on, which is a bold move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that's even a bold move for people nowadays. Like, just think about a corporate office setting. You're like, this speech is not going well. If you're in a room full of men, or like boss man is speaking and you step in and say, like, actually, this isn't going so well. Let me finish this for you. Let me take the job off of your hands. And then now think about that as a free Black woman.
Right.
I mean, granted, it was Philly, you know, and that was a place where lots of abolitionists were. There was a spirit of freedom and independence and anti-slavery and all of that. So consider the context, but also consider the context. You know what I'm saying? So she gets up and she preaches, she does her thing, and then she sits down scared. She talks about how she's frightened after that. So she felt it in the moment, but right after she was like, uh-oh, what did I do? And she thought she might be kicked out of the church, which is a fair assumption to make. But Bishop Allen gets up and he tells the congregation that she asked him 8 years ago to preach. So he acknowledges what happened before. And he tells the congregation, he's like, and I said no. She asked me to preach, but I said no. But now he believes that she's called to the work. He's like, I've witnessed this. I've seen the evidence of you really being a good preacher and being able to do this. And that's a reversal, because not only was the first part of like her getting up a total anomaly and a risk for her, but like to have the man who has such a position of power over the church and in the church and has already said no to her to affirm what she's driven to do in this moment, also something that is so deeply personal and spiritual, probably felt very vindicated. I mean, I'm speculating, but you know, that is huge. That's a huge deal for that to happen like that in that moment and immediately. It's not like she was punished then, and then later on he was like, I think I was wrong that second time. It happens immediately. So I think that's a very fascinating moment in her story. It's clearly a turning point because this is where we get to her first. He's basically given her the approval to keep preaching. She feels relief about that. It gives her the strength to keep preaching, but she's still not ordained technically, but she is allowed to preach. And Bishop Allen supports her travel and her preaching, and he and his wife babysat her kids. So that's really helpful in her being able to go out and preach in different places. She can't preach in the church. She's not ordained to do that. So this is where we get to this next phase of her life. She is, you know, had these come to God moments. She's been married and now her husband died, and now she's like fulfilling this thing that has been an inkling in her and growing and growing and growing, and now it's finally blossomed. And she goes out and she starts traveling around and preaching in friends and family members' houses, meeting houses, schools, and courthouses. So being an itinerant preacher was a big thing for people at the time. There were men who were doing it, and Jarena Lee is doing it now too. It was still difficult for women and going out and preaching, especially during times of slavery. And Maryland was a slave state, and she was going to Maryland to preach. So she was going to places where it was risky and dangerous for her to be speaking in front of these crowds. But traveling around, preaching from place to place, you know, you had these different denominations who were trying to get people on their sides. And so there were the Baptists over here, and people were coming to the Baptists. And it was like, we're in election season. So it's like you trying to capture more votes to try to bring more people into the voter registration process. It's kind of like they were out there knocking on doors. She was out there giving sermons in all kinds of places and hopeful about bringing as many people in as possible to her faith. She really felt called to the AME church when she was kind of skeptical about Methodist church when she first went. And then she had a connection kind of in the beginning of her story. She talks about that. So she's traveling around to all these different places and giving sermons, but she has got to make some money to take care of her children and get back home at some point. So she opens a school and she says that she teaches 11 students. And eventually she does get enough money to go back to Philly. She has a sketchy journey by ship. She says it was pretty perilous, but she gets to Philly on November 12th, 1821. And she still continues traveling in the area and beyond. And one of my favorite things about her autobiography is how specific she is. She talks about walking miles and miles. She's going by wagon and by boat to some places. She talks about giving multiple sermons in, a day. And she even goes to Canada. She is preaching to all different kinds of congregations too. So there are Black congregations, and she really wants to speak to Black people, but there are also mixed congregations, which wasn't even a thing that people really wanted. They didn't want women speaking to mixed crowds at the time, especially Black women. And, she's traveling to states where, like I said, Maryland, people are enslaved in Maryland. And she's preaching to enslaved people as well. So enslavers would allow enslaved people to go to sermons. Sometimes enslaved people were walking many, many miles to get to her sermons and then walking back to the plantations to labor in the morning. And Jarena kind of justifies a lot of the bad things happening around, like antagonism and hatred, by calling it the work of the devil sometimes. But in 1823, she goes back to Philly, and the bishop offers her a preaching position at Bethel Church, but there are still folks there who are against a woman preaching. So this is something that still comes up. So she's traveling a lot of places, and family members are putting her on, people she knows are putting her on, and she's being allowed to preach in some places, but she still is facing a lot of opposition in places to her being a woman preaching. It is the case in her autobiography, as it is in a lot of other enslaved people. Something that I'm fascinated by is, like, a lot of the times they don't dwell on the antagonism that they were facing. They're not like, a lot of the time enslaved people who are like in contact with a lot of people who are traveling around the US, or not even enslaved people, Black people who are free. If they're talking about traveling around the US during slavery times, like, sometimes they don't dwell on the moments where they're like, this happened when I was in this place and I was in grave danger and it was so risky and they almost killed me. And you just know that there are tons of stories like that in between all the moments that they are talking about. And she doesn't really dwell on that too much, although she does acknowledge the difficulties that she had. But she gives all kinds of sermons. And once she's even invited to an enslaver's house to give 3 funeral sermons for 2 adults and a child. So I'm trying to put myself in her shoes and think about how focused she is on her mission of imparting the knowledge and the wisdom of God and the church onto anybody and everybody, including people who have done really vile things, people who hate the sight of her and want her dead, people who consider other people property. She is so called to her work that she travels far. She goes into detail about the number of miles that she walks and the number of sermons that she gives. And it's thousands of miles that she walks over a period of time, and over 100 sermons that she gives over a period of time. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And of course, she's invested in that spiritual path and preaching, but she's also invested in anti-slavery. She's not like a really big, or it doesn't seem like, based on records, that she was an abolitionist who was constantly working for the abolition of slavery. But she does in 1834 go to an anti-slavery meeting in Buffalo, New York. And in her autobiography, she talks about how horrible and violent and wicked the institution of chattel slavery is. But this is where we get to her other first. So in 1836, she publishes the first edition of her autobiography, which is The Life and Religious Experience of Jarena Lee, a colored lady, giving an account of her call to preach the gospel. And that's what makes her the first Black American woman to publish an autobiography. In 1844, she submits an expanded autobiography to the AME Church and their book committee, but they ignore her request. It takes her a few years to get it back up and off the ground, but in 1849, she publishes an extended version of her autobiography with another press. And this is one that everybody can access online. You can go and read it. And like I said, she gets pretty meticulous in her own record keeping. In a lot of moments, it really feels like a diary, like it's a journal. Like I could see her dating these things. She keeps dates, people, the names of people that she meets. It is very detailed. She gets into the weeds about where she travels and who she sees and all of that. And at the end of the autobiography, she says this: P.S. Please to pardon errors and excuse all imperfections, as I have been deprived of the advantages of education, which I hope all will appreciate, as I am measurably a self-taught person. I hope the contents of this work may be instrumental in leaving a lasting impression upon the minds of the impenitent. May it prove to be encouraging to the justified soul and a comfort to the sanctified. So Jarena, in 1853, she speaks at the American Anti-Slavery Society's convention in Philly. But as is unfortunately the case for a lot of people, she is poor at the end of her life. There was a report in the records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society about her, and it said that in her last days, she depended on the contributions of others. And it also says that a little while before she died, she said she wished she was done with begging. She died on February 5th, 1864 in Philly, and her legacy and story were rediscovered around the 1980s because her work kind of faded out of the consciousness for a while, as often happens in other people's stories. And in 2016, though, the AME Church ordained her posthumously at the 50th quadrennial session of the General Conference. So she did get recognition by the AME Church. And of course, thankfully, all of the historians and scholars have unearthed more information about her and still are putting out more information about her and researching her. So that is great, even though her legacy kind of faded for a little while.
What a story. What a story. And I mean, yeah, there's so many instances she has where I can just visualize this happening and the importance of it. And we were discussing when we were together in DC the importance, as we always talk about, of having things like an autobiography or a diary or what have you. But it is fascinating too, because we do talk about religion a lot on this show, and this is still a thing. This is still, like, we did a whole episode, and some of you are going to be like, duh, but we did a whole episode where I was like, can a woman be the Pope? And the answer was no. Like, the answer is no. But it's still a point of conversation and contention in so many religions. And I know friends who have left churches because of they won't allow women to preach or what have you. So having this feeling moved to do that and taking that risk is quite the story. And then knowing that we are still talking about this stuff.
When you say your friends left churches because of that, are they in smaller denominations? Are they major religions? Like, or is it the specific church that they're going to that has those principles? I
feel, and probably Samantha will know more than I, or maybe even you, Yves. I don't know, but I feel like there's so many fracturing within denominations. It's a specific sect of baptism, I think.
Okay.
But I know it's not always the same. Like I was raised Presbyterian, and right now my mom there's a more liberal, I guess, interpretation of Presbyterian that she went down. My uncle went down a more conservative interpretation of Presbyterianism, and they're like fighting about it, and he's saying he might leave the church. So, but I guess what I'm saying is it's not. I know denominations can break down in a couple of different ways, but it is still a thing. And my friend, who I believe is some version of Baptist, I'm not very religious, I think it's obvious. She, her church didn't allow women to preach, and she just wasn't about it.
Not here for that, understandably.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we know that the Southern Baptists just went back initially and separated. I think they created a whole new level of denomination this year, within the
Recently,
last year and a half, because some churches have allowed for women to become preachers. So they are no longer part of Southern Baptists. So they had to kind of like drag them out or remove them from that sect. Like as it's continued to grow, and I know like when it comes to Western religions, specifically when it comes to Christianity, it's all fracturing more and more and more and more, because I will not allow this versus, but this is maybe a new interpretation, or maybe you've always been interpreting the Bible wrong kind of conversations and controversies have happened since its existence. We know that, like when we talk about like the awakenings, they're because of like the splintering, as well as when we're talking about like hellfire brimstone era, which was one of the awakenings. But like all of those conversations have become the same conversation, the same controversy. It just becomes more and more splintered. So Baptist is probably, I will say this in my experience, Baptists have become one of the fastest to splinter. I could say that, and then Methodists a former Methodist may come after me and be like, "Nuh-uh, you don't understand.
We're breaking apart faster."
Right, like this level of like dissent. They're like, "Nuh-uh." But in my experience, especially with within the U.S., again, is that conversation too, that I've seen the Southern Baptists splinter really quickly, very fast, and smaller, dwindling down. Mm-hmm. So, not dwindling down, but existing, I guess, in a small
And there was
number.
there was recently a big break about LGBTQ plus people, allowing them in the church, and that made a lot of news. So it is like still this conversation of who, that quote that I can't remember, but was very well put, of like, doesn't God's word speak to everybody?
Right.
Like, that's still a huge factor in these splinters and in these interpretations of who is allowed to be part of the church and who is allowed to preach and spread that word.
I mean, the conversation about salvation is such a hot topic. And then apocalypse, those two right there break down so many of the denominations. Even within Catholicism and Protestantism, that's a still big conversation about like the way of salvation, as well as the end of the times. What does this look like? And it's constant debates.
Mm-hmm. I do find it really fascinating in Jarena Lee's story, because I was raised religious and then went away from it. Mm-hmm. And she, as you said, had sort of the opposite.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me because I remember having like a complete breakdown as a 9-year-old and being like, I lied to my teacher. And it was a small lie, But to me, that was because of, the idea, even though I wasn't Catholic, but like that confession of like, you did a lie, it's bad, you have to tell someone. But she was feeling it even without that. So I'm just very curious if there were outside forces, if that's just like a human, like a natural human thing that makes you feel that way. Because for me, I thought it was religious. I was like, oh God, I'm going to hell.
Yeah. For Jarena, I don't know what it was for that initial experience of the lie and feeling like, she said, the Spirit of God moved in power through my conscience. That feels like a very it was an embodied thing. It just came from me and I didn't know where it came from, is what it sounds like then. Although later, one of the people I think she was hired out to, one of those families was Catholic. So they could have been impressing a lot upon her then, but the beginning of her awakening happened before that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm not so sure about the entire religious underpinnings of that family that she was working for when she told that lie. So maybe that was there. But from the way she describes it, it seems like it was a spontaneous reaction to something that just like she was inspired by, that just exhaled out of her spirit, basically.
Okay, and I might have missed it. Did she get caught or did she confess to that lie to that family?
I don't think she says anything about that in her autobiography, Samantha. Like, she doesn't really talk about her saying anything after she told the lie. She just says, I said yes, but it wasn't true. And I told myself I wasn't going to tell another lie. My instinct is to say that she didn't confess to it, to at least the person that she lied to, just because it might, like, the trouble that she would get in, the punishment might be great.
Right.
You know? So I would imagine she probably didn't admit to it after she told it.
Yeah, I just wondered, because had she had done that and they used that as an opportunity, I'm sure she would have put that as part of her story to, like, quote unquote, witness to her or testify to her, essentially, about her mistakes and grave sins. I just wondered. And now there's a bigger question, because I think, and this is not anything to do with Jarena, just in overall experiences when I see adults or older people become converts or converting to more religious aspects, it helps explain the troubled past that they may have had. Whether it was my fault because I am human and I was not looking for salvation, or finding some way to be saved. The need to be saved is so big that it kind of brings you out of that. It makes you, quote unquote, clean. Because who doesn't want to be told you're remade and all the mistakes that you made is gone now. It's wiped away. And from now on, it'll forever be wiped away. Just remember to ask for forgiveness. And then there's this level that I've seen with adults who have converted or, quote unquote, say they've been saved. It's a much needed restart. And I understand that. I understand that to so many things, whether it's you've lost somebody and you're like, oh, this is why this happened, or, you know, I had to go through this to be this better person, hoping that you are a better person. And I feel like people, not to criticize anyone, and I say this about myself, who use my own past in this way, the more tragic, I'm going to put this in quotes, or the hardships that you felt like you've gone through, if the more that there is, the more that there has been, the greater the story and the greater the renewal is, it kind of becomes a bigger testimony in your head, being like, no wonder I had to go through this. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Again, this has nothing to do with Jarena. This is just my thought process and how people convert this way, you know, from being a child to an adult and seeing like the flip-flop of people who don't understand what this might look like and why it's important to them. That's just that conversation. And then like having Jarena really just step forward and preaching in an atmosphere where she was told she was not welcome, that on herself, and coming back with like, oh my God, well, what did I do? What did I do? Feeling like that was the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, as my people would say, moving her. And of course, this is why the door opened.
Yeah.
And it just makes that validation even bigger. And it's amazing too, but like having that can heal so many people in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, when you say that makes me wonder what would have Jarena been had she not found religion, if she did have mental illness, and if she still would have dealt with suicidal ideation.
Right. Like if that saved her, that's amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's in her words, it seems like it did, because she said it was the arm of God or whatever it was. So, yeah. I mean, not only was she a pioneer, I mean, for her own personal sake, like her experience with finding God in this way might have been very fortuitous for her.
Right.
Yeah. And I do think one of the comforts of religion is that we live in a world that feels very out of your control, out of your, like, you don't have power to control it a lot. And so when I see people sometimes talk about it, it feels like it's like a way of saying, well, I did everything I could, but there's some things I just can't control. Mm-hmm. But I love that Jarena in that moment stood up. Like she did it almost the opposite of like, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to do this. I'm going to deliver this sermon, sit back down. So it's almost like she was making her own path in my interpretation. But also I feel that is what religion, why it comforts so many people, is that you can do like everything and some things are just out of your control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When you were talking about her standing up in that moment and making her own path, I was just thinking about the people like who are like, I made this role for myself. You know how the language around like the corporate boss girl. Yeah. Like if the role isn't there, then go make it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what Jarena was doing.
Exactly. Which she was ahead of our times.
She was ahead of her time. Okay. Yeah. And that is also just a great scene cinematically. Yes. A great cinematic scene. I had a really good time reading and that part of her autobiography. So, having said that, I will add the caveat that yes, everyone go read her autobiography. You know, I will give y'all the link to it online so y'all can get to it directly. Mm-hmm. But I will say there are great moments, and in some moments it drags. It's one of those experiences because there are moments like that one that are really fun to read. And then there is, well, I did 178 sermons and I walked 2,221 miles. And then I went to Philadelphia and then I walked down the road and I did this sermon. And then I met these two people. Like it is a lot. It gets to be a slog in some moments, y'all. I'm going to be real.
It's got some pacing issues.
Yeah, it's got some pacing. Thank you. Let's talk quickly here. That was the critic in you coming out. I love to see it, but it definitely does. So your eyes might glaze over in those moments, but I'm grateful for it existing because we learned so much about her day to day and how she was feeling about it. And I wonder if it was a comfort for her. I mean, it might just be part of her personality, but she kept so many notes on the things that she did that I don't do. And I'm just like, wow, like there is no way I would be able to recall these things with such great detail about, in my life. And I don't keep such detailed notes day to day, like in a diary kind of way about each person I met, each place I went. So grateful for her knowing that her story was important as it was happening and that she was supposed to record it and that she was supposed to publish it.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. And thanks again, Yves, for bringing this story to us. This was a great one. And obviously, we have a lot to say about religion. So where can the good listeners find you?
Y'all can find me on Instagram at Not Apologizing. That's pretty much the only social media I'm on right now, but you can get in contact with me at yvesjeffcoat.com. That's spelled YVES, Jeff Coat, exactly like it sounds.com. You can also find me on many, many other episodes of Sminty here doing Female First, talking about women who were pioneers in history. And you can catch me on Theme, which is a podcast about Black storytelling. Yeah, that's it.
Yes. And listeners, go check out all of that stuff if you have not already. Thanks as always, Yves, for being with us. And you can contact us, listeners, if you would like. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I've Never Told You. We have a YouTube. We have a TeePublic store. We have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite show.